Okay, the second talk in this session is from Sarah Daisy Kosa, Discrepancies in Reporting Between Trial Publications and Clinical Trial Registries in High-Impact Journals. Off you go.
Hello, my name is Daisy Kosa. I come to you from McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, and I'm a member of the McMaster Adherence to Reporting Standards Group. It's a really quite a large team. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. I'm an unfunded part-time student, but I'm honored to be part of a great team. So in order for clinical trial registration to work to ultimately prevent publication bias, it needs to be complete and accurate. But it's unclear currently the extent to which this is really the case, particularly with respect to the full range of key study conduct items. To address this gap, we undertook a study to examine the number of key study conduct items reported with agreement between the clinical trial registry and the published paper. We also investigated some factors associated with adequate reporting. We conducted a literature search. It was in PubMed. The reason we only used PubMed was because we selected only the top 5 general medicine journals to be included in the study, and they're all indexed in PubMed. The sample of studies was all RCTs from 2012 to 2015, and 50 studies were randomly selected from each year. We extracted data on each key study conduct item and whether or not it agreed between the clinical trial registry and the published manuscript, as well as a few basic study characteristics. It's really a very simple design. We calculated some descriptive statistics for the percentage of studies on which there is agreement between the trial published paper and the trial registry. We also conducted adjusted analyses looking at what factors might be associated with adequate reporting, so the number of key study conduct items, and this includes type of funding, year of publication, sample size, number of sites. We also looked at prospective registration versus retrospective and journal. So this is the characteristics of included studies. So you can see that the majority of them actually had less than 1,000 participants and less than 50 sites, and were non-industry funded and prospectively registered. And you can just see the distribution of the journal publication there. So this little graph here depicts the level of, so in green, if you look at study type, intervention, study arm, current primary outcome, that's where we're doing very well. So this is the types of items that you see reported consistently between the registry and the manuscript. Start date, funder, and sample size, we're looking at about 50%. And then we start not doing so well around certain things like primary completion date, and I think the most interesting is the current secondary outcome measures. There was a lot of problematic and inconsistent reporting, which I think could be a whole separate study in and of itself. So in terms of the adjusted analyses, we actually found that number of sites, year of publication, as well as, interestingly, publication in JAMA, was associated with an increased number of key study conduct items reported with agreement between a trial published paper and the current clinical trial registry. So I'll actually delve a little bit more deeply into those findings. I'm just being mindful of time here. So where does this study fit in the greater context? So we did identify significant discrepancies in reporting. We are definitely not the first to have done that. And actually, when you compare our findings to a similarly designed study, which was drawn from a wider range of journals, we found higher levels of agreement. So better reporting overall. However, a similar range of discrepancies in reporting over the key study conduct items. Some things reported relatively consistently and other things not reported very consistently at all. I think part of the explanation for our differences might be that our sample was from the top 5 general medicine journals, and perhaps things get worse when you go down, but maybe not given your findings. So just go back to the adjusted analyses. So a larger number of sites was associated with reporting more key study conduct items with agreement. So Dr. Bandari is on our study team, and he conducts huge trials in orthopedic surgery, and he could not fathom this finding because he said that it doesn't make sense because the more sites you have, the more you have to change things. But it's important to note that we're talking about current. So I took the most current information recorded in the registry, not that which was originally recorded. So this is assuming everyone's best intentions that at the time that they published this paper, that we're looking at that clinical trial registry and seeing if it compares. So anybody could have at any time updated the registry to make sure it was accurate and complete. So I'm thinking perhaps that, because we had another study and we found something similar when we were looking at abstract quality reporting, that this has more to do with perhaps training. Maybe I have access to more methodologists on these larger teams. I don't know. I really couldn't explain this particular finding except to think that perhaps there's some kind of checklist being used. I'm not really sure. Or something to do with the editorial process. Or it could be spurious. Non-industry funding was associated with poorer reporting, and that's actually been found in some other small studies, and that might just simply have to do with resources and training. Industry-funded trials sometimes have access to better trained personnel and more resources to ensure accurate reporting. Just somewhat discouragingly, it didn't get better with time. So 2012 actually had the best reporting quality. And that is somewhat in contradiction to some earlier studies that have been done. So I don't know if that's because we're moving farther away from consort and all the buzz. I'm not really sure. But that was one thought we had. I will fully acknowledge this is a subset of publications in the included journals. This was a comprehensive examination project for me, so I had to get it done within a certain time frame. So I couldn't review all of the studies that were published during that time frame, but that would obviously be ideal. Additionally, the findings may not be generalizable to other disciplines or lower impact journals. So how do these findings help and why do we care? If we can understand some of the factors associated with good reporting, perhaps we can capitalize on those factors to direct training and interventions to improve reporting. For example, we may need to adapt some of these measures in the context of modern clinical trial design and make sure people are aware, especially scientists, that they should be updating those registries, and it's not a bad thing. It's not a representation of bad science that you change with the information in the registry to reflect the most recent study conduct information, and that perhaps they're just forgetting to do that. And it also, for me, really brought home that just because it's in JAMA or New England Journal of Medicine does not mean it is as written and perfect. So that for myself, I really took away that I needed to be very careful and really check whether these things were accurate as compared to the clinical trial registry. And additionally, finally, I wonder, especially in the context of this conference, whether or not there could be some kind of checklisting system or something for peer reviewers and editors to simply require that they check their clinical trial registry and ensure it's up to date prior to publication. And maybe it's, one of the automated feedbacks you get in that email from the journal. So here are my references, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yes, please.
Hi, thank you for that presentation. I have one comment and one question. So the comment about industry funding, I think as a journal editor, I'm Debbie Levine from the Journal Radiology,
Yeah.
when something comes with industry funding, we look at it with extra care.
Mm-hmm.
And that means we search out that clinical trial and we match everything up. So it could be that the better reporting is because people are taking more care with the industry-funded trials. My second is more of a comment in that if people think that they can change clinicaltrials.gov after they've already enrolled patients and they change their protocol and they decide to emphasize some other outcome, we are failing in the entire purpose of having your protocol there. So I don't think it's good advice to only look at the updated protocol. I think that as authors, editors, peer reviewers, we need to look at what was done when patients were enrolled so that we can be sure that the planned analyses were performed.
So on the first point, thank you, because that would be helpful for discussion. And on the second point, I entirely agree. So we didn't present the findings of looking at the original registry here today, but we did actually look at that as well. And there's been quite a bit of work done in primary outcomes and how people change those. And I think particularly with respect to that, trial end date, we're not so worried about. And that's why with this type of analysis, with number of key study conduct items, we took the current. But that's why I was talking about the current secondary outcomes. It's wishy-washy. There is a lot of selective reporting and, things that are not very good. But I think that is a very important question and a whole separate kettle of fish.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Evan Mayo Wilson, Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. Thanks for a great presentation. And I wanted to pick up on that last point you were making about outcomes. So my question is, the discrepancies that you're identifying in outcomes, did you record or do you have any anecdotes about the level at which the changes are occurring? Are they flagrant changes in the domain? Are they changes in the measure? What is the way in which the outcomes are actually switching?
So we took a look at that. Just because of limited space, we didn't report it here. Maybe a separate presentation. But we actually looked at the factors associated with primary outcome reporting discrepancies as well as describing those specific discrepancies. A lot of them have to do with changing the timeline or switching one of the secondary outcomes and primary outcomes. So we looked at major discrepancies. So if it was a wording, pedantic kind of change, that wasn't what we were looking for. If it was a change in the timing, so there was no time frame and now there is a time frame, that was a big one. Partially, I think, because the clinicaltrials.gov started enforcing that at a later date. And the major one we saw, I think it was about 30%, were swapping of secondary outcomes and primary outcomes.
Thank you.
Please.
Les Citrom, International Journal of Clinical Practice. Thank you so much for your presentation. This is one of the things that as peer reviewers, we encourage looking at it quite carefully whether or not the paper actually matches up with what was pre-specified. Just a comment here, I think we're in for some kind of more difficulties when the protocols and analytical plans are going to be posted. It's going to create a lot of uncertainty and a lot of extra work as well if we have to then scrutinize the report with what was pre-specified, and I'm not sure where we're going to be headed there.
I wonder about the burden on peer reviewers and editors, and actually as an author of a small clinical trial, I have to say when I undertook this study and I went to publish my study, that is the point at which I updated the clinical trial registry. And it was a good reminder to me, look, there's this, we changed this and that, and I had to explain that. And I do think a lot of burden does lie on the authors. And perhaps it's more a question of, like I was saying earlier, maybe it's just a question of pushing back to the authors and saying, hey, we noticed this doesn't appear to be up to date. You need to do the hard work of fixing that, and then send it back to us.
Okay, yep.
Lisa Barrow, University of Sydney, and that was very interesting. And I was struck, since one of your main conclusions is about the lack of industry funding and the reporting, or the lack of discrepancies, but I was surprised that about 50% of the studies did have discrepancies in industry funding. So I'm wondering, which did you believe, and sort of what nature were the discrepancies, and did you just eliminate those ones that had discrepancies from the analysis?
So it's a good point. So we took the paper, the published manuscript, to be the source of funding, and then categorized them as follows. And if they had any industry funding at all, so if it was a big list and there was an industry person anywhere, industry agency anywhere in that list, it was industry. So that's how we categorize that. But I do agree it's a bit broad strokes. Would have been nice to kind of maybe separate that out a little bit more.
Okay.
Hi, Anwen Chan, University of Toronto. Thanks, this is great work. I have a question relating to prospective versus retrospective registration. And I think I saw in one of the graphs that 37.5% were retrospectively registered, which is very disappointing considering that these are the top journals that require prospective registration. Can you comment on how you determined or defined prospective registration, and can you comment on that, I guess, this disappointing finding?
Yeah, we took the published clinical trial start date and we compared it to the registration date in clinicaltrials.gov or another registry. If it was there was a few that actually were not registered in clinicaltrials.gov or were registered other places. And I was somewhat surprised, but in defense, some of the trials were very old. So they'd been started prior to some of these requirements coming into place. So you can sort of excuse it a little bit more. And I did take a snapshot of it, and you do see this trials with the earlier start dates are less likely to be prospectively registered. So that's somewhat encouraging. So it suggests that over time it's getting a little better. And again, that analysis was just me trying to satisfy my own curiosity about what was going on.
Eric Turner with Oregon Health and Science University. Just wanted to address speak to the concern about increasing workload on reviewers. If they're going to be looking at the protocol or the details of the registration. I think that the premise is that that's somehow added on top of everything else that they do. And I don't think that's necessarily the case, because first of all, if you review the protocol or the original methods, and then you quickly look at the manuscript and you see that you're looking at something completely different from what is reflected in the protocol, you can pretty much stop there, in my opinion, and no need to get into the nitty-gritty details of the presentation. Nevertheless, a second option would be to seems to me that you could detail a reviewer to just do a consistency review of the protocol. If you have more than one reviewer, why not, since it's a very important task, focus on the methods and the consistency with the protocol and registration details, and leave it to others to get into the presentation. And just a thought.
I think it's a great suggestion, and I would note, having done it, the time required to check whether something agrees is not actually that time consuming, because the tabular view makes it quite easy. As long as it's reported in the manuscript in a way that's easy to identify, that's more of the challenge. Looking at the registry is quite straightforward to spot check. The thing that was time consuming was teasing out that primary outcome, secondary outcome sort of thing that requires a little bit more sleuthing.
Can I follow that up? The consort checklist includes items about changes, explaining changes from the protocol, and by implication, I think changes from the registry entry should be seen in the same light. Did you see much attempt in these papers for authors to admit that they changed things and explain it?
So I think that we didn't collect this, so I'm saying this informally. I was somewhat surprised that there wasn't more of that. Because I think there's this perception that it's bad. Sometimes you have to change things because of restrictions in how, having conducted a trial, we started recruiting in satellite patients because we ran out of patients in the in-center. We had to. And we just justified that and explained its potential implications. And if anything, it can strengthen the transparency. I feel more comfortable. I find it hard to believe you recruited 2,000 patients and never changed a single part of your protocol.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.